For over 100,000 years, humanity lived in constant motion, following the rhythms of the seasons and the migrations of great herds. Our ancestors were masters of their environment, their lives a nomadic dance across the vast plains and through the dense forests of the Paleolithic world. Every day was a cycle of searching, gathering, and hunting. But beneath the surface of this enduring way of life, a quiet revolution was beginning, one that would fundamentally alter our relationship with the earth and with each other. This was the dawn of agriculture. It was a deliberate, profound shift. In scattered pockets of the Fertile Crescent, beginning around 10,000 BCE, people began to transition from harvesting wild grasses to intentionally cultivating them. They selected the seeds of wild wheat and barley, choosing those with larger grains and more resilient stalks, and planted them in the fertile alluvial soils. This was not a sudden act, but a slow process of co-evolution. Alongside the cultivation of plants came the domestication of animals, with wild aurochs, goats, and sheep being tamed for their meat, milk, and wool. This newfound control over food sources marked the end of an era. The consequences of this change were staggering and immediate. A stable food supply meant that populations could grow more rapidly and sustain themselves in one place. Nomadic bands gave way to permanent settlements, built from mud and wattle, creating the first villages. This sedentary lifestyle led to an accumulation of possessions. No longer constrained by what they could carry, communities began to develop new technologies, such as pottery for storage and looms for weaving textiles. As food production became more efficient, not everyone was needed in the fields. Labor began to specialize, and new social roles emerged: the artisan, the builder, the priest. This surplus of food also introduced concepts of wealth and hierarchy, laying the groundwork for the social structures that would define all subsequent civilizations. From the simple act of putting a seed into the soil, a new world was born. It was a world of unprecedented stability and growth, a world of security and permanence. But it also carried the seeds of its own vulnerabilities. As villages became dependent on specific crops and fixed locations, they became more susceptible to the very environmental forces that they sought to control. This revolutionary step, in rooting humanity to the land, created the foundation for everything that was to come, including the eventual collapse of that very world. But that era held many secrets yet to be uncovered. Could a flood myth from 4,000 years ago, a story we still tell today, be a collective memory of a real-world climate catastrophe? What if the Stone Age wasn't a time of constant struggle, but a period of profound peace? And why did that world end so violently, leading to ever-emerging wars? How did a world that perfected the technology of stone, without a single metal tool, fall to an enemy who weaponized fire itself? Just a quick announcement. If you enjoy this video so far, please subscribe to our channel, as it motivates us to bring you a new story every evening. This is the only kind request tonight, and we won't bother you with it anymore until the very end of today's story. Let's get back to the video. The profound shift to a settled agricultural lifestyle did more than simply change how humanity acquired its food. It fundamentally reshaped its spiritual world. For millennia, nomadic societies' religious beliefs were intrinsically tied to the animal kingdom, the hunted beasts, the cycles of migration, and the spirits of the wild. But with the advent of farming, the focus of reverence shifted from the animal to the earth itself. This new faith centered on the principles of fertility, cycles of life, and the nurturing power of the soil. This was the era of the flourishing of fertility-based worship, a spiritual system built on a new promise: the earth would provide. Archaeological evidence from Neolithic settlements across the Near East, Anatolia, and southeastern Europe reveals a widespread and consistent religious worldview. The most prominent artifacts are small anthropomorphic figurines, often female, with exaggerated breasts, hips, and bellies. These so-called mother goddess figures, found in homes, ceremonial spaces, and burials, were not uniform deities, but likely local representations of a universal concept: the power of creation, birth, and renewal. Their presence underscores a society in which the divine was closely linked to the generative force of both human and agricultural life. This new faith was deeply integrated into the fabric of daily existence. Rituals were not grand, distant affairs, but intimate communal acts performed in the hearths of homes and the shared courtyards of villages. The belief in a divine, nurturing force provided a psychological anchor for communities now dependent on the unpredictable cycles of planting and harvest. Ceremonial vessels and pottery were often decorated with geometric patterns and symbols related to water, sun, and plants, reflecting a religious art that was both practical and sacred. The cyclical nature of the seasons, planting in death and reaping in life, was mirrored in religious practices and beliefs about the afterlife. The social order of these early communities was also deeply intertwined with their faith. While complex hierarchies were not yet fully formed, spiritual leaders and figures responsible for rituals likely held significant social roles. The promise of divine benevolencia, bountiful harvest, and healthy offspring was a unifying force that fostered social cohesion. It was a worldview that celebrated stability, abundance, and the continuity of generations. But this belief system, so perfectly suited for a time of settled prosperity, was also an expression of hope and trust in a world that would soon prove to be far less predictable. The promise of the Great Mother, a fundamental pillar of this flourishing era, was about to be put to the ultimate test. The agricultural revolution enabled humanity to put down roots, but it was the aggregation of these roots that produced the first true urban centers. These were not cities in the classical sense, but unprecedented concentrations of population that represented a new level of social complexity and organization. Archaeological sites like Çatalhöyük in modern-day Turkey, inhabited from approximately 7,500 to 5,700 BCE, provide the most comprehensive window into these early proto-urban settlements. Its unique, honeycombed structure and social organization challenge many long-held assumptions about the origins of urban life. Çatalhöyük was a city without streets. Its inhabitants lived in a dense network of mud brick houses, built directly adjacent to one another. Entry into each dwelling was through the roof, accessed via ladders. This design created a walkable cityscape of interconnected rooftops, with communal activity and transit occurring on a horizontal plane above the living spaces. This highly integrated architectural style suggests a community with a remarkable degree of social cohesion. The lack of public squares or designated religious buildings points to a society where daily life was deeply communal and sacred spaces were decentralized. Rituals and spiritual practices were conducted within the privacy of individual homes, as evidenced by the elaborate murals, reliefs, and burial practices found inside. The social structure of these early settlements appears to have been remarkably egalitarian. Archaeological analysis reveals little evidence of centralized authority, such as a king's palace or an administrative center. Dwellings were largely uniform in size and internal decoration, suggesting a minimal level of social stratification. There is no clear indication of a ruling class, and resources seem to have been distributed with a high degree of equality. The community's interconnectedness extended to their dead, individuals were buried beneath the floors of their homes, a practice that literally embedded generations within the fabric of the dwelling. This created a profound sense of continuity and a tangible link to one's ancestors, with houses being passed down through families for centuries. Çatalhöyük's unique layout also served a practical purpose: defense. The absence of streets and the single-point entry system would have made it a formidable fortress against external threats, suggesting a collective concern for security. This proto-urban form, therefore, was a brilliant solution to a series of social and environmental challenges. It was a testament to a collaborative ethos that, for nearly 2 millennia, allowed a large population to live in dense proximity without the need for the hierarchical power structures that would later define urban civilization. It was a complex, self-contained world woven together by an invisible thread of cooperation. The establishment of permanent settlements and the development of specialized crafts created a demand for raw materials not available in every location. This economic necessity spurred the creation of the first extensive trade networks, which acted as silent, invisible threads connecting disparate communities across vast distances. These routes were not just pathways for goods, but also conduits for the exchange of information, ideas, and cultural practices. The very fabric of Neolithic civilization was stitched together by these ancient arteries of commerce. Archaeological analysis has provided conclusive evidence of these networks through the tracing of specific materials back to their geological origins. Obsidian, a volcanic glass prized for its sharp edges, serves as a prime example. Found in a limited number of sources, such as those in Anatolia and the Aegean, obsidian was traded over hundreds of kilometers. Tools and blades made from this material have been discovered in sites as far away as the Levant and southeastern Europe. Scientists can use techniques like X-ray fluorescence to determine the precise chemical fingerprint of an obsidian artifact, matching it to its original volcanic source. The presence of artifacts from multiple sources in a single settlement indicates a complex, multi-directional flow of goods rather than a simple, linear supply chain. Alongside obsidian, marine shells, particularly those from the Mediterranean and Red Seas, were highly valued for their use in jewelry and ceremonial objects. These shells, like the obsidian, traveled far from their coastal sources. A variety of shells originating from the Mediterranean have been unearthed in landlocked regions like Central Europe. The presence of these objects in burials and ritual deposits suggests they held significant symbolic value, perhaps representing a connection to distant sacred places. The trade in such luxury and ceremonial goods underscores a level of social sophistication beyond simple subsistence. The movement of these materials reveals a trade system based on reciprocity and trust. Rather than operating as a centralized commercial enterprise, these networks were likely a series of interlocking, smaller-scale exchanges between neighboring communities. Goods were passed from village to village over generations, with each community acting as a node in the network. This down-the-line exchange system ensured that even without a formal market or currency, valuable resources could travel over significant geographical distances. These silent networks, therefore, were a testament to the collaborative ethos of the Neolithic world. They were a foundation of interdependence and mutual benefit, but their very existence made these communities vulnerable to the shocks that would soon disrupt them. The breakdown of these trade routes would be one of the first signs of the coming collapse. As Neolithic communities became rooted in place, and their societies grew in complexity, they began to express their beliefs and social order through monumental architecture. While the mud brick villages of the Near East were impressive, in other parts of the world, particularly across Western Europe, the cultural focus shifted to stone. This was the era of megalithic construction, a period defined by the deliberate shaping and movement of massive stones to create structures that would endure for millennia. These monoliths were not merely feats of engineering. They were a profound expression of collective identity, astronomical knowledge, and a new shared ceremonial life. The construction of these megaliths, such as dolmens, menhirs, and stone circles, required an extraordinary level of communal effort and sophisticated organization. Without metal tools, communities relied on stone, wood, and sheer human ingenuity. The quarrying of stones, sometimes weighing dozens of tons, was a painstaking process of heating and cooling, followed by the use of wedges and levers. Their transport, over distances of up to 200 kilometers, was a collaborative undertaking involving the use of wooden sleds, rollers, and ropes. This immense labor, likely performed by the entire community, served to reinforce social bonds and a shared sense of purpose. It was a physical manifestation of a society that worked as a single, unified entity. Archaeological and archaeoastronomical research has revealed that many of these structures were built with remarkable precision and a deep understanding of celestial movements. Sites like Stonehenge in England and Karnak in France are aligned with the solstices and equinoxes, suggesting their use as astronomical observatories or ritual calendars. This ability to track the sun, moon, and stars was of critical importance to an agrarian society, as it enabled them to predict seasonal changes and schedule agricultural activities. The monuments, therefore, were not just religious symbols, but also practical tools that integrated human activity with the cosmic order. Beyond their astronomical function, these structures served as focal points for large-scale communal gatherings, ritual practices, and ancestor veneration. Their sheer scale and permanence created a sense of stability and historical depth, connecting the living to the sacred landscape and to generations past. The shared experience of their construction and use fostered a cultural cohesion that spanned regions and transcended the individual village. The megaliths were a testament to a collaborative ethos and a shared faith. But as the climate and social order began to shift, these grand monuments would face a new challenge, a world in which the collective will that built them was beginning to fracture. Their eventual decline would signal the end of a unique era of human endeavor. With a shift to agriculture, humanity's survival became deeply intertwined with the predictable cycles of the seasons. Planting, growing, and harvesting required an accurate calendar, and without a written system, ancient societies turned to the most reliable timepiece available, the sky. This was the birth of archaeoastronomy, a field of study that reveals how Neolithic peoples were not just passive observers but sophisticated astronomers who used the movements of celestial bodies to order their lives, rituals, and collective memory. Archaeological evidence from sites across the globe demonstrates a widespread and precise knowledge of the heavens. Megalithic monuments in Western Europe, such as the Newgrange Passage tomb in Ireland and the stone circles of the British Isles, are meticulously aligned with the annual cycles of the sun and moon. The entrance to Newgrange is specifically oriented to capture the sun's light on the winter solstice, illuminating the inner chamber. This event was not a coincidence. It was a deliberate act of engineering that required generations of observation and the transmission of complex astronomical data. It served a dual purpose, a physical marker of the year's shortest day, and a powerful ritual event that symbolized the rebirth of the sun. This celestial knowledge extended beyond the solstice. At sites like the Ness of Brodgar in Scotland, complex astronomical alignments track a variety of celestial phenomena, suggesting a detailed understanding of lunar cycles and possibly planetary movements. This was a form of empirical science, passed down orally and encoded in the physical landscape. The monuments themselves were the textbooks, the calendars, and the cathedrals of this early world. The builders understood that a monument's enduring presence could make the ephemeral movements of the sun and stars a fixed, predictable part of human experience. The integration of this astronomical knowledge with daily life and ritual was complete. The calendar of the sky dictated when to prepare fields, when to plant seeds, and when to expect the harvest. It also structured social life, with major communal gatherings and festivals timed to coincide with celestial events. The ceremonies that occurred at the solstices were not just celebrations. They were reaffirmations of a community's place in the cosmic order. The shared experience of witnessing a celestial event at a sacred site reinforced social bonds and a collective worldview. This deep connection to the heavens provided a sense of stability and divine order. But as this fixed and predictable world began to change with shifts in climate and increasing social pressures, the very belief system that had guided these communities would prove to be a source of profound vulnerability. The heavens, once a source of comfort, would soon whisper of disruption. While some Neolithic communities focused their monumental efforts on stone, others turned to the very earth itself, shaping the landscape on an unprecedented scale. These constructions, known as earthworks, were just as significant and required an equally profound level of societal organization. The most impressive and enigmatic of these is Silbury Hill in Wiltshire, England, a massive man-made mound constructed from approximately 2400 to 2300 BCE. It stands as a testament to the collective will and engineering capabilities of a society operating on a grand scale. Standing over 30 meters high and 167 meters in diameter, Silbury Hill is the largest prehistoric earthwork in Europe. Its construction was a monumental undertaking, estimated to have required millions of man-hours of labor. The process was meticulously planned and executed in distinct sequential phases. The initial stage involved clearing the site and building a small circular core from chalk. Subsequent stages saw the addition of concentric rings of chalk and soil, meticulously laid and compacted to create the hill's conical shape. The final layer was a compacted surface of gravel and turf. The sheer volume of material, an estimated 500,000 tons of chalk, was quarried from ditches that ringed the base, which were later filled in. This level of coordination, without a written language or formalized administrative system, speaks to a society with highly effective command structures and a shared unifying purpose. The exact function of Silbury Hill remains a subject of archaeological debate. Despite extensive excavations, no burial has ever been found, ruling out the theory that it was a simple tomb. Its location, just a short distance from the Avebury stone circles, suggests that it was an integral part of a vast ceremonial landscape. Theories propose it was a territorial marker, a ritual platform for ceremonies, or a monument to a deity or a founding lineage. What is certain is that its purpose was not practical, it was ideological. The act of its creation was a ritual in itself, a communal undertaking that would have brought together people from a wide area for a shared, long-term project. The construction of Silbury Hill and other large-scale earthworks reveals a society at its apex of social cohesion. The ability to organize and sustain a workforce of this size for over a century points to a surplus of food and a stable, effective form of leadership. It required not just labor, but a strong social contract and a belief system powerful enough to compel generations to a single, non-utilitarian goal. This was a society with a clear vision and the organizational power to manifest it in the physical world. However, this apex of collective endeavor would be fleeting. As environmental pressures and social fragmentation began to take hold, the cohesive vision that built such monuments would be the first thing to unravel. The Neolithic revolution, enrooting humanity to the land, transformed not only how people lived, but also what they created. As the burden of constant movement lifted, communities gained the time and stability to develop specialized domestic crafts that became central to daily life. Among the most significant of these were pottery and weaving, technologies that revolutionized food storage, preparation, and personal expression. The mastery of these crafts, often centered around the domestic hearth, reflects a profound shift in human ingenuity from the grand scale of earthworks to the intimate realm of the home. The invention of pottery, which occurred independently in various parts of the world, was a technological leap with far-reaching consequences. For the first time, people could create durable, non-porous containers for storing surplus grains, cooking food, and transporting water. This was a critical innovation that enabled a sedentary lifestyle and a more secure food supply. Neolithic pottery was crafted without the potter's wheel, relying on techniques like coiling and slab building. The vessels were then fired in open pits or simple kilns, transforming soft clay into a hardened, functional material. The forms and decorations of these vessels were not purely utilitarian. They were also a form of artistic expression. Geometric patterns, incised lines, and applied clay motifs tell us about the aesthetic sensibilities and symbolic world of these early communities. Weaving and textile production were equally transformative. Before the Neolithic period, clothing was primarily made from animal hides. With the domestication of animals like sheep and the cultivation of plants such as flax, threads could be spun and woven into cloth. This new technology provided more comfortable and versatile clothing, and the act of weaving itself became a central domestic activity. Evidence from early settlements, including loom weights, spindle hauls, and carbonized textile fragments, shows the widespread practice of this craft. Textiles were more than just garments. They were a canvas for cultural identity, with specific patterns and colors likely signifying clan affiliation, social status, or ritual purpose. The complexity of some of the recovered woven materials demonstrates a high level of skill and an understanding of intricate techniques. The flourishing of these domestic crafts highlights a society with a growing surplus of time and resources. The specialization of labor meant that skilled artisans could dedicate their lives to perfecting their craft, leading to a rapid acceleration of technological and artistic development. The hearth, the central point of the home, became the workshop where clay was shaped and fibers were spun. This was a world defined by the quiet, creative labor of its people, a world of innovation that was built on permanence and stability. But like the monumental earthworks, these domestic arts were rooted in a way of life that was about to be challenged by the forces of climate and conflict. The popular image of prehistory is often one of constant struggle and conflict. Yet the archaeological record of the early and middle Neolithic periods presents a compelling counter-narrative. The evidence, particularly from Europe and the Near East, suggests a long period of relative peace, a unique era where social organization was built on cooperation rather than on defense. The most striking proof of this is the widespread absence of fortifications in early farming settlements. Unlike the towns and cities of later periods, which were defined by their defensive walls and moats, early Neolithic villages were largely open and unfortified. Sites such as Çatalhöyük in Anatolia, a dense proto-city, had a unique clustered architecture that offered a form of passive defense, but it lacked the explicit walls, gates, and watchtowers that would characterize later defensive structures. This architectural choice indicates a minimal concern for large-scale external threats. The focus was on communal living and access, not on exclusion and protection. This pattern of unfortified settlement is found across a wide geographical area, from the linear pottery culture of Central Europe to the settlements of the Fertile Crescent. The archaeological record further supports this theory with the scarcity of weapons designed for interpersonal conflict. While hunting tools, such as bows, arrows, and spears, are abundant, a distinct lack of armaments for warfare is observed. The stone axes and daggers found were primarily multi-purpose tools, used for felling trees, working wood, and butchering. They do not exhibit the design feature such as reinforced blades or specialized grips that would mark them as dedicated weapons of war. The absence of mass graves, systematic burn layers, and widespread skeletal trauma from battle wounds further suggests that large-scale, organized violence was not a common occurrence. Instead, evidence points to a society that resolved disputes through other means, possibly through ritual, mediation, or communal consensus. This peaceful existence was not a result of naivete, but a reflection of a society's priorities. The collective energy was directed towards agriculture, monument building, and craft production activities that benefited the entire community. The social structures and egalitarian nature of these societies, where resources were shared and status was not tied to aggression, fostered a collaborative environment. This cooperative ethos was the foundation of the Neolithic world's success, a period of sustained growth built on a social contract of mutual benefit. However, as environmental pressures began to mount and resources became scarcer, this peaceful order would be put to the test. The first sign of its unraveling would be the emergence of the very fortifications that had been absent for so long. The Neolithic era, despite its name, was far from primitive in its technological sophistication. It was, in fact, the zenith of stone tool production, a period when humanity perfected the craft of flint knapping to an extraordinary degree. This was a world defined by the cutting edge of stone, a technology that was versatile, reliable, and deeply understood by the artisans who mastered it. This period of perfection occurred before the arrival of metal, and its collapse would mark the end of a long, unbroken lineage of technological knowledge. The archaeological record demonstrates a remarkable evolution in stone tool technology. Early Neolithic tools, while functional, were often crude. But by the middle of the period, specialized techniques and a high level of craftsmanship became the norm. The pressure flaking method, in particular, allowed for precise control over the shaping of flint. Artisans would use a pointed tool, often made of bone or antler, to apply focused pressure to the edge of a blade, creating a series of small, uniform flakes. This allowed them to produce tools with incredibly sharp, durable edges, far superior to anything that could be achieved with simple percussion. This advanced technology led to the creation of a diverse and specialized toolkit. The Dorset cursus in England, for example, is not just a monument, but a testament to the scale of earth-moving projects that required a consistent supply of highly effective stone tools. The polished stone axe, a hallmark of the Neolithic, was not just a symbol of status, but a functional tool of immense importance. The polishing process, while time-consuming, significantly increased the axe's strength and durability, making it an essential implement for clearing forests, building structures, and working wood. Evidence from workshops shows a clear process of standardization, with tools being produced in specific shapes and sizes to serve a variety of purposes, from farming to carpentry. The trade in high-quality flint and chert was a major economic driver. Places with rich sources of these materials, like the mines at Grimes Graves in England, became centres of industry. These were not just quarries but extensive mining operations, with shafts dug deep into the earth to access the best quality flint seams. The scale of these mines and the organization of labor required to operate them speak to a society with complex resource management and a well-developed network for distributing the finished goods. The perfection of stone tool technology was a collective achievement, built on generations of knowledge and skill. It was the material foundation of the Neolithic world's success, providing the tools needed for farming, building, and cultural expression. But this golden age was a product of a stable and predictable world. As climate change and social pressures began to mount, the very tools that had built their world would prove inadequate to solve the new problems of conflict and competition. The arrival of a new, more malleable material would spell the end of the Stone Age and usher in a new era of technology and warfare. The flourishing of Neolithic civilization was a product of a relatively stable and favorable climate that had endured for millennia. However, around 4,200 years ago, this stability ended abruptly. Archaeological and paleoclimatological evidence points to a global-scale climatic event, now known as the 4.2 kiloyear event, which brought a period of severe aridity and cooling. This was not a gradual shift, but a rapid onset of drought and dust. A catastrophic change that would expose the fundamental vulnerabilities of the world's first agrarian societies. The evidence for this event is multifaceted and globally distributed. Ice cores from Greenland and Antarctica show a sharp, dramatic drop in methane levels, which correlates with a reduction in global wetland activity, a direct indicator of a sudden and widespread drought. In the Near East, sediment cores from lake beds show an increase in dust and a decrease in pollen, signaling widespread desertification and a collapse of agricultural activity. Similarly, in Asia, monsoons weakened, leading to the abandonment of major settlements in the Indus Valley and the disappearance of the Akkadian Empire in Mesopotamia. This was not a localized phenomenon, but a synchronous event that affected multiple continents and civilizations. For Neolithic communities, the consequences were devastating. Their entire way of life was predicated on a predictable climate and a stable water supply. The sophisticated irrigation systems and rain-fed agriculture that had sustained large populations for centuries began to fail. As rivers and lakes receded, and predictable rains gave way to dust storms, the agricultural surplus that had fueled population growth and social complexity evaporated. This loss of a stable food source had a domino effect, leading to widespread famine, social upheaval, and mass migration. The cooperative social structures that had been built on a foundation of abundance and mutual aid proved ill-equipped to handle the new pressures of scarcity and competition. The political consequences were equally profound. The Akkadian Empire, which had unified Mesopotamia under centralized rule, collapsed within a few generations. The city of was abandoned, and other urban centers saw a dramatic decline in population. The social contract, which had promised security in exchange for tribute, was broken. This environmental stress also led to the fragmentation of the social order. Hierarchies that had once been based on consensus and religious authority were replaced by those based on military strength and control of dwindling resources. The era of cooperation and peace was over. The 4.2 kiloyear event was not just a climate change, it was a societal reset, a brutal test that no civilization built on the old ways could withstand. The 4.2 kiloyear event manifested in its most destructive form as a catastrophic and widespread drought. This was not a temporary dry spell, but a prolonged period of severe aridity that caused rivers to shrink, lakes to vanish, and groundwater sources to plummet. For the first time, early agrarian societies, which had built their entire existence on the abundance of water, faced an environmental collapse that their social and technological systems were not equipped to handle. The archaeological record provides stark evidence of this hydrological disaster. In the Near East, the vast network of rivers and seasonal streams that had watered the Fertile Crescent for millennia began to fail. In Mesopotamia, the complex irrigation systems that fed the cities of Akkad, and others became ineffective. As the water levels of the Tigris and Euphrates rivers dropped dramatically, evidence from paleoclimate studies of sediment cores shows a significant reduction in river flow and an increase in wind-blown dust from the newly exposed riverbeds. The failure of these core water sources led directly to widespread crop failure and famine. The agricultural surplus that had sustained a dense urban population and its specialized labor force vanished, forcing a mass exodus from the cities into the surrounding, equally parched countryside. The effects were also visible far beyond the urban centers. Ancient lakebeds across North Africa and the Arabian Peninsula, which had previously supported thriving pastoral and hunter-gatherer communities, completely dried up. The once green Sahara, which had been home to a variety of flora and fauna, rapidly transformed into the desert we know today. This environmental desertification forced entire populations to abandon their traditional territories and migrate in search of new, viable land. These mass migrations, in turn, placed immense pressure on the resources of the regions they entered, leading to conflict and social instability. In the Indus Valley, the monsoon system, a lifeline for the major urban centers like Mohenjo-Daro and Harappa, weakened drastically. The predictable annual rains that had irrigated the fields and recharged groundwater sources became unreliable. Archaeological evidence shows a clear pattern of abandonment of major settlements, with populations dispersing into smaller, more sustainable villages. This decentralization was a direct response to the collapse of the centralized food production system that had been a hallmark of their civilization. The vanishing of the waters, therefore, was not a singular event, but a cascading failure of an entire ecological and social system. It was the fundamental test of a civilization built on the assumption of water's permanence, and in its failure, it revealed the fragility of the Neolithic world. The success of the Neolithic revolution created a demographic challenge that would prove to be a major contributing factor to its eventual collapse. For millennia, a stable agricultural base and a sedentary lifestyle had fueled a steady and unprecedented growth in population. As communities grew from small villages to large towns and even proto-cities, they placed an increasing and unsustainable strain on the surrounding landscape. The balance between human numbers and the capacity of the environment to support them began to fracture, and a world of apparent abundance gave way to a new reality of scarcity and competition. The archaeological record provides clear evidence of this demographic shift. The number and size of settlements across the Near East and Europe increased dramatically during the Neolithic period. What began as a few dozen people in a small village expanded to thousands living in dense, interconnected communities. This concentration of people required a corresponding expansion of agricultural land. Forests were cleared, marshes were drained, and fragile ecosystems were converted into farmland. This process, while initially successful, led to a slow but inevitable depletion of the very resources on which their societies were built. Soil fertility, a key component of their agricultural success, began to decline as fields were used repeatedly without adequate time for rejuvenation. The problem was exacerbated by the lack of advanced agricultural techniques. Without knowledge of crop rotation, fertilization, or fallowing on a large scale, the land's productivity diminished with each passing generation. The same land that had once fed a village now struggled to support a larger, more complex society. This was an economic and environmental Ponzi scheme, a population boom fueled by a surplus that was slowly consuming its own foundation. As the land became less productive, the demand for more land increased, leading to further deforestation and soil erosion. The strain of overpopulation was not just agricultural. The demand for other resources, such as wood for fuel, building materials, and tools, led to the depletion of forests, which in turn contributed to soil erosion and desertification. The rivers and streams, once reliable sources of water, were increasingly polluted by waste from a larger population and struggled to sustain the new larger communities. This environmental stress created a social feedback loop. As resources became scarce, a collaborative and peaceful social order began to fray. Competition for land and water replaced the old ethos of mutual aid, and the first signs of conflict began to appear. The weight of numbers, therefore, was a silent and relentless force, a slow-building pressure that would eventually combine with climate shock to trigger the end of a world. The Neolithic revolution was built on a foundation of soil. For the first time, humanity understood the potential of the earth to provide a consistent and abundant food source. However, this success masked a fundamental vulnerability: a lack of knowledge regarding long-term land management. The first farmers, pioneers in a new way of life, were unaware of the principles of sustainability. They lacked the techniques of crop rotation, fertilization, and systematic fallowing, leading to a slow but inevitable exhaustion of the very soils that had enabled their prosperity. The apathetic earth, no longer able to provide a surplus, would become a major factor in the unraveling of their civilization. The archaeological record shows a clear pattern of diminishing returns in early agricultural regions. Studies of soil samples from ancient settlement sites reveal a decline in key nutrients and organic matter over time. Early farming practices, which involved clearing a patch of land and planting monocultures of wheat or barley year after year, depleted the soil of its vital components. While this slash-and-burn or temporary cultivation method worked for a time, it was not a sustainable long-term solution for growing populations. As the fertility of one plot of land diminished, farmers were forced to clear new areas, leading to further deforestation and soil erosion. This created a feedback loop of land degradation and expansion, placing an ever greater strain on the environment. This reliance on a finite resource, without a plan for its renewal, was a critical flaw in the Neolithic system. Unlike later civilizations that would develop sophisticated methods to enrich the soil, such as the use of animal manure, legumes, and fallow periods, the first farmers were locked into a cycle of depletion. The agricultural surplus that had fueled population growth and social complexity began to shrink, even in years with favorable rainfall. A community that had once fed 1,000 people from a set area of land now required a significantly larger footprint to produce the same yield. This created direct competition for viable farmland between neighboring communities and contributed to the social friction that would eventually lead to conflict. The exhaustion of the soil was a silent and insidious process. It did not create the dramatic shock of a sudden drought or a catastrophic flood. Instead, it was a slow bleed, a gradual loss of productivity that made the entire system increasingly brittle. When the climate shocks of the 4.2 kiloyear event finally arrived, they did not hit a world of robust, healthy ecosystems. They struck a fragile system already weakened by centuries of unsustainable land use. The collapse, therefore, was not a singular event, but the culmination of a series of environmental and social vulnerabilities that had been building for generations. The Neolithic belief system was built on a covenant with the divine. The gods would ensure the fertility of the earth, and in return, humanity would provide reverence and ritual. When the droughts of the 4.2 kiloyear event struck, and the apathetic earth ceased to yield its bounty, This fundamental spiritual contract was broken. For communities that had relied on a benevolent divine order for generations, the ensuing crisis was not just a physical famine, but a profound theological one. This was an era of desperate measures and a silent heaven, as the old rituals, which had always brought abundance, now seemed to fail completely. Archaeological evidence from this period reveals a dramatic increase in ritual activity, suggesting a society trying to re-establish a connection with the divine. Excavations in settlements and ceremonial sites show an unusual number of votive deposits, offerings of precious materials, tools, and food that were intended to appease the gods. These offerings were not the modest, regular tributes of a prosperous time, but were often extravagant and, in some cases, desperate. In regions like the Balkans and Central Europe, ritual deposits in wells and springs, which were once sources of life, became a way to petition the vanishing waters. This focus on water-based rituals highlights the central role of the drought in the spiritual crisis. The traditional pantheon of nurturing, fertility-based deities, particularly the mother goddess figures, seems to have lost its efficacy in the face of widespread crop failure and starvation. The small figurines, once so abundant in every home and hearth, appear less frequently in the archaeological record from this period. Their prominence waned as a new kind of spiritual authority, focused on more dynamic and powerful, often male, deities associated with storms, sky, and war began to emerge. The silence of the old gods was interpreted not as a test, but as a profound betrayal, prompting a search for new spiritual powers capable of controlling the harsh new reality. This spiritual desperation led to an increase in public, collective rituals, a final attempt to unify communities through shared suffering and prayer. The focus shifted from intimate, domestic rituals to large-scale, public ceremonies designed to demonstrate communal piety. However, when these grand rituals failed to bring the rain and the crops remained withered, the social and spiritual fabric of the communities began to unravel. The failure of the gods to fulfill their promise led to a loss of faith in the leaders who had mediated between the community and the divine. This spiritual vacuum contributed directly to the breakdown of social cohesion and the fracturing of a once unified world. The famine of the gods was a testament to a world that was losing its theological anchor, a crisis that would have profound and lasting consequences. The Neolithic era was characterized by a cooperative ethos and a notable absence of large-scale conflict. Early settlements, from Çatalhöyük to the villages of the linear pottery culture, were largely open, unfortified, and seemingly built on a social contract of mutual trust. However, the environmental and social pressures of the Stone Age collapse brought this long period of peace to an abrupt end. As resources became scarcer and populations more desperate, a new and darker imperative emerged: the need for defense. The archaeological record shows a dramatic and widespread shift from open communities to fortified villages, a physical manifestation of a world turning against itself. The earliest evidence of this transition is seen in the construction of defensive structures around formerly open settlements. In Europe, around 4000 to 3000 BCE, archaeological sites begin to show a clear pattern of fortification. Villages that had existed for centuries without any form of wall or ditch were suddenly enclosed by palisades, earthwork ramparts, and sometimes even stone walls. The Michelsberg culture in Central Europe and the settlements of the Iberian Peninsula provide striking examples of this trend. These were not the massive stone fortresses of a later age, but rather a series of concentric ditches and wooden stockades. designed to protect a community's resources and people from external threats. The purpose of these fortifications was clear. They were not just for defense against marauding bands, but also for controlling access and establishing a clear boundary between us and them. The presence of these walls indicates that a community's most valuable assets, its food stores, livestock, and most importantly, its people, were now considered to be at risk. This shift required a fundamental change in social organization. The egalitarian structures of the past, which were based on consensus, were replaced by a need for a new type of leadership capable of organizing large-scale labor for defense and of commanding warriors to protect the community. This was the beginning of a social hierarchy based on military strength and a newfound control over resources. The proliferation of these fortified settlements coincided with a noticeable increase in the archaeological evidence of violence. Skeletal remains from this period show a higher incidence of trauma consistent with weapon wounds. The tools of the hunt, such as spears and bows, were now being used for war. The first walls, therefore, were more than just a physical barrier. They were a symbolic break from the old world. They marked the end of an era defined by a cooperative social contract and ushered in a new reality where security was no longer a given but had to be taken and defended. This was the world that would lead directly to the emergence of the first swords and the rise of the professional warrior. The Neolithic era, in its cooperative phase, left a minimal archaeological footprint of organized violence. However, as the pressures of climate and population intensified, this long period of peace came to a definitive end. The material record from this transitional period reveals a brutal new reality, with the first clear and widespread evidence of intercommunal conflict. The tools of the hunt were now turned against fellow humans, and for the first time, weapons designed exclusively for warfare began to emerge from the earth. The most visceral evidence comes from the analysis of human remains. Archaeological sites dating to this period show a marked increase in skeletal trauma consistent with violent death. Skulls from various burial sites exhibit signs of blunt force trauma, indicating blows from clubs or maces. Arrowheads, often made of flint, have been found embedded in human vertebrae and other bones, a clear indication of death by projectile. Furthermore, the presence of parry fractures on forearms suggests that individuals were attempting to defend themselves from an attack. This pattern of trauma, found in multiple skeletons within a single community, points to something beyond individual homicides. It suggests a collective experience of violence. Simultaneously, the nature of weaponry itself underwent a profound change. The multi-purpose tools of the earlier Neolithic, like the polished stone axe, began to be replaced or supplemented by implements designed specifically for combat. While early axes could be used in a fight, their primary function was for felling trees and working wood. In this new era of conflict, archaeological inventories show the first signs of purpose-built war clubs, maces, and specialized daggers. These were not tools of production, they were instruments of destruction. The design of these objects, with features such as reinforced heads, weighted ends, and more aggressive shapes, leaves no doubt as to their singular purpose. They were the stranger's sword, a sign that the old social contract had been broken. This increase in violence is further corroborated by the appearance of mass burial sites. The Talheim death pit in Germany, for example, while dating to a slightly earlier period, provides a chilling precedent for the kind of large-scale massacre that became more common as the Neolithic world fractured. These pits contain the remains of entire communities, men, women, and children who were killed in a single event and deposited without ceremony. This evidence suggests a strategic shift in warfare from simple raiding to total extermination, with the goal of eliminating a rival group and seizing their resources. This brutality was a direct result of the immense pressure of resource scarcity, with communities fighting for control over dwindling food, water, and land. The stranger's sword was a physical manifestation of a world turned on its head, where survival was no longer guaranteed by cooperation but by conquest. The Neolithic revolution, in its early stages, fostered a remarkably egalitarian social structure, with resources shared and power distributed through communal consensus. However, as agriculture became the primary mode of subsistence, it introduced a new dynamic: the accumulation of wealth and, with it, the potential for inequality. When the environmental pressures of the 4.2 kiloyear event intensified, the egalitarian ideals of the past fractured, giving way to new social hierarchies forged in the struggle for survival. The plough, a symbol of progress and productivity, became an instrument of social stratification, a curse that divided a once united world into rulers and ruled. The transition from a cooperative to a hierarchical society is visible in the archaeological record from the transitional period. In earlier Neolithic settlements, such as Çatalhöyük, dwellings were largely uniform in size and content, suggesting a minimal difference in social status. However, as the climate worsened and harvests became less reliable, a new pattern emerged. The size and quality of houses began to vary dramatically. Some individuals and families lived in larger, more substantial homes, while others occupied smaller, more precarious dwellings. This architectural divergence is a physical manifestation of a society where access to resources was no longer equal. The emergence of a class-based society is further corroborated by changes in burial practices. Earlier Neolithic burials often contained few grave goods, with social status seemingly tied to age or achievement within the community. But during and after the collapse, burials became a clear marker of a person's social standing. Some individuals were interred with a rich array of grave goods, including rare materials like obsidian and polished stone, while others were buried with little to no accompaniment. A small number of burials, often of men, contain the first purpose-built weapons, the maces and daggers, that signal a new military elite. This was the birth of a warrior class, a group that derived its power not from communal contribution, but from its ability to control and defend resources. The economic engine of this new social stratification was the control of agricultural land and food surplus. As yields became unreliable due to drought and soil exhaustion, those who could control the most productive land and accumulate a food surplus gained immense power. They could trade their surplus for valuable goods, host lavish feasts to gain loyalty, and, most importantly, provide for the community in times of famine. This created a system of patronage and dependency, where the majority of the population became reliant on a small, powerful elite for their survival. The egalitarian dream of the early Neolithic was over, replaced by a new reality where power, wealth, and status were tied to the control of resources, a curse that continues to shape our societies to this day. The Neolithic world was a civilization built on the mastery of stone, wood, and clay. But as its social structures fractured under environmental pressure, a new material began to appear, not as a tool for production, but as a symbol of power and a catalyst for social change. This was copper, and its earliest use was not for the practical work of farming or building, but for the creation of ornaments that signified a new kind of authority. This was the birth of metallurgy, a technology that would prove to be a double-edged sword, a source of both unprecedented wealth and a new, brutal hierarchy. The first use of copper, known as the Chalcolithic or Copper Age, was a transitional period. Archaeological evidence from sites in the Balkans, the Near East and Central Europe shows that native copper, found in a pure, unalloyed state, was hammered and shaped into beads, pendants, and other decorative items. This process, known as cold hammering, did not require the high temperatures of smelting and was a logical extension of stoneworking techniques. However, the value of these objects was not in their function but in their rarity and the effort required to acquire and shape them. Copper was a difficult material to find and a laborious one to work, making the finished products a clear indication of a person's status and access to resources. The presence of copper ornaments in burials, particularly those of men, is a key indicator of the rise of a new elite. These individuals, likely clan leaders or emerging chieftains, were interred with copper beads, pins, and even small axes that were too fragile for practical use. The inclusion of these items in a burial was a statement of power, a physical manifestation of a person's ability to command labor and control a resource that was a clear step beyond the traditional stone and bone. This was a new form of wealth, one that was portable, permanent, and visually distinct from the old ways. This new power, however, was not based on communal contribution or age, but on control over a new economic engine. Those who had access to copper sources and the knowledge to work the material gained immense influence. They could trade these valuable items for food, labor, and loyalty, creating a new system of patronage that cemented their position at the top of the social hierarchy. The egalitarian dream of the early Neolithic was over, replaced by a new reality where power was measured not in the skill of one's hands, but in the gleam of copper. This new material was a symbol of a divided world, and its discovery was the first step toward the violent transition that would define the end of the Stone Age. It was a harbinger of a world that would soon be shaped not by stone, but by metal. The first use of copper was a simple extension of stone working techniques, a process of cold hammering that required no profound technological leap. But the true revolution came from an entirely different discovery, one that was likely an accident, an unforeseen consequence of other Neolithic crafts. This was the moment of accidental smelting, the transformative process of applying heat to rock and witnessing the emergence of a new liquid substance, metal. This was the birth of true metallurgy, the alchemist's secret that would forever change the human relationship with materials and power. The most plausible theory for this discovery ties it to the practice of pottery. Neolithic potters would have constructed firing pits or primitive kilns, and in these they would have used specific types of rock to support their vessels or line their kilns. If a copper-rich ore, such as malachite, was placed in the intense heat of a kiln with a reducing atmosphere low oxygen, the heat would have been sufficient to melt the copper and separate it from its host rock. The glowing liquid metal would have pooled in the bottom of the kiln, a magical and unprecedented sight for a people who had only ever known solid materials. It was a discovery born from observation and serendipity, not from a deliberate search for a new technology. This accidental process revealed two critical properties of copper that cold hammering had not: its ability to be melted and its malleability in a liquid state. This meant that copper could be cast into molds, allowing for the mass production of uniform objects. This was a technological leap far beyond the laborious one-by-one process of shaping stone tools. The discovery of casting allowed for the creation of more sophisticated and more durable tools than ever before possible, from axes and adzes to daggers and spearheads. This was no longer about crafting a rare ornament. It was about creating a new class of functional tools. The knowledge of smelting would have been a tightly guarded secret, a form of intellectual property held by a small, specialized group of artisans or shaman-like figures. Those who understood this process held immense power. They could transform common rock into a valuable and transformative material, making them central figures in the new social hierarchy. This new class of metallurgists, or proto-alchemists, would have been highly valued and likely commanded significant status. Their craft was seen as a form of magic, a command over natural forces that put them on a higher plane than the traditional stoneworker. This secret knowledge was a new form of currency, one that would give rise to a new economy and a new kind of power. This was the final step away from the Neolithic world and into the era of metals, a transition that would be as violent as it was transformative. The accidental discovery of smelting unlocked the secret of copper, but it was the purposeful creation of bronze that truly initiated the Metal Age. Bronze is an alloy, a combination of copper and tin, and its creation required a deliberate and sophisticated understanding of metallurgy. This technological leap, from pure metal to an alloy, resulted in a material that was far superior to both stone and copper. It was harder, more durable, and more suitable for creating a new class of tools and weapons. The knowledge of how to make it and the materials required traveled across continents, a whisper that carried immense power and transformed the old world forever. The geographical distribution of bronze artifacts reveals a complex and interconnected network of trade and knowledge. Copper ore was relatively common in certain regions, but tin, the essential component for bronze, was exceptionally rare. Major sources of tin were limited to places like the British Isles and parts of Central Asia. The demand for tin, therefore, created the first large-scale, long-distance trade routes for a single material. Archaeological evidence from shipwrecks and caravan sites shows a flow of tin ingots from these sources to the major copper-producing regions of Europe and the Near East. These were the Bronze Age highways, channels for the movement of not just goods, but of people and ideas. The diffusion of this new technology was not a uniform process. The knowledge of how to create bronze was a tightly guarded secret, a specialized skill held by a small number of artisans. These master metallurgists, or smiths, were highly mobile. They would travel from settlement to settlement, sometimes over great distances, bringing with them their expertise in the technology of casting. Their craft was considered a form of magic, and their status in society was elevated, as they possessed the unique ability to transform raw materials into objects of immense value and power. They were the key figures in a new economy, one based on resource management and technological know-how. The impact of bronze was immediate and profound. Its superior hardness meant that bronze tools could outperform their stone and copper predecessors. Bronze axes could fell trees more efficiently, and bronze sickles could harvest crops faster. But its most transformative effect was in warfare. A bronze sword or spear was a far more lethal and effective weapon than its stone counterpart. This new technology of war gave a decisive advantage to those who possessed it, leading to a new level of military stratification. The Bronze Whisper was therefore not just a tale of technological diffusion, it was a story of social and political change. The circulation of this new knowledge and material would ultimately lead to the consolidation of power, the rise of a warrior class, and the final demise of the egalitarian Stone Age world. The Neolithic belief system was a direct reflection of its environment, a world of nurturing abundance. Faith was centered on the Great Mother, the fertile earth, and the cyclical nature of life. Its rituals and practices were designed to ensure a bountiful harvest and healthy offspring. But as the climate changed and the earth itself became a source of scarcity, this foundational spiritual contract was broken. For societies that had defined their existence by their relationship with a benevolent, life-giving divine force, the failure of the old faith was not just a crisis of belief, but a profound and devastating existential collapse. Archaeological evidence from the period of the 4.2 kilo-year event shows a clear spiritual fracturing. The small female figurines that had been ubiquitous in every home and burial site for millennia began to appear less frequently and were often damaged or fragmented. This decline in the material record of the mother goddess cults suggests a loss of efficacy. The deity who had promised abundance was no longer delivering. The old rituals, performed with such care and reverence, failed to bring the rain or restore the soil's fertility. This failure created a theological vacuum, forcing communities to question the very tenets of their faith and the social order that was built upon it. This spiritual crisis was not a singular event, but a prolonged and agonizing process. As the famine and conflict became more widespread, the old beliefs offered no comfort or explanation for the suffering. This led to a search for new divine powers that could offer protection in a world that was now defined by its brutality. New deities began to emerge, often with more aggressive and powerful attributes. These were sky gods and storm gods, figures who could wield forces of destruction as well as creation. Their ascendancy is reflected in the archaeological record by new votive offerings and the emergence of more militaristic iconography on pottery and other artifacts. The old communal ceremonies, which had served to unify communities through shared ritual, became less frequent or were recontextualized for different purposes. The focus shifted from collective appeals for a good harvest to individual or clan-based rituals for protection and success in conflict. This spiritual fragmentation mirrored the social breakdown of the time. Without a shared faith to bind them, communities lost their moral and social center. The breakdown of the old faith, therefore, was not a side effect of the collapse, but a central component of it. It left a spiritual void that would be filled by new, more aggressive beliefs and a new class of leaders who could promise not prosperity from the earth, but victory from their rivals. The world was losing its spiritual anchor, and the consequences would be violent and lasting. The monumental stone circles of the Neolithic era, built with immense communal effort and aligned with celestial events, were not just physical structures. They were the central anchors of a shared spiritual and social order. But as the world was plunged into a period of climatic instability and social fragmentation, these grand sanctuaries, which had once united communities, became symbols of a failed past. The decline of these megalithic sites was not uniform. It was a complex process of abandonment, reappropriation, and, in some cases, outright desecration, reflecting a profound loss of faith and the rise of a new, more pragmatic reality. Archaeological evidence from sites across Western Europe tells a consistent story of decline. In many locations, construction on new stone circles ceased abruptly around the time of the 4.2 kilo-year event. The collective energy and social cohesion required for such massive projects simply vanished. As communities struggled with famine and conflict, the long-term, non-utilitarian labor of monument building was no longer a priority. The focus shifted from grand, unifying projects to the immediate concerns of survival. This cessation of construction is a powerful indicator that the social contract, which had once compelled thousands of people to work together for a common ritualistic goal, had been broken. Furthermore, many of these sites were either abandoned or repurposed. Excavations at sites like Stonehenge show that after a long period of use, the monument saw a dramatic decrease in ritual activity. Its use as a major communal gathering place waned, and its function as a central religious site was replaced by smaller, more localized ceremonial practices. This decentralization of ritual life mirrored the political and social fragmentation of the time. The grand unifying public spaces were no longer relevant to a world where communities were isolated and defensive. Perhaps most telling is the evidence of intentional damage to some of these monuments. At certain sites, stones were toppled, broken, or recarved. A clear act of desecration rather than simple decay. This deliberate destruction suggests a spiritual crisis where the old gods and their sacred places were blamed for the misfortunes of the era. The failure of the old faith to provide comfort and abundance in a time of crisis led to a rejection of its physical symbols. The monumental stone circles, which had once been a testament to a benevolent divine order, were now seen as relics of a broken promise. The decline of these sanctuaries, therefore, was not merely an architectural shift, but a profound spiritual and social collapse. A symbolic end to a world built on stone and faith. The battle for survival had begun, and the old circles were the first to fall. The early Neolithic world was defined by a governance model built on consensus. In a society where resources were generally abundant and threats were minimal, decisions were made through communal discussion, and leadership was likely based on age, wisdom, or spiritual authority. This social contract, which prioritized cooperation and egalitarianism, was a hallmark of the period. However, as the pressures of the 4.2 kiloyear event intensified, and the world became one of scarcity and conflict, this system proved to be unsustainable. The old model of consensus-based leadership fractured, giving way to new forms of authority based on control, wealth, and military strength. Archaeological and anthropological evidence from the transitional period reveals a clear shift in social organization. The egalitarian structures of early settlements, where houses were uniform and grave goods were minimal, began to disappear. This was replaced by a more hierarchical society, as seen in the increasing size and complexity of certain dwellings and the growing divergence in burial practices. The emergence of a small number of individuals buried with a disproportionate amount of wealth, including rare materials like copper and teenies, a direct sign of a new social elite. These were the first proto-chiefs or kings, individuals who had consolidated power and resources. The new forms of rulership were not based on the old communal ideals, but on more pragmatic principles. The ability to control a food surplus, to secure a reliable water source, and to defend a community's resources became the new basis for authority. Leaders who could provide security in an increasingly dangerous world gained immense influence. They were the organizers of labor for the construction of defensive walls, the mediators in disputes over land, and the commanders of the first armed groups. Their power was not a result of a communal vote, but of their proven ability to ensure survival. This shift to hierarchical rule had profound consequences for the social fabric. The old consensus-based decision-making process, which was too slow and inefficient for a world in crisis, was replaced by a more centralized command structure. Decisions could be made more quickly, but they were also made by a smaller group of people who may not have had the entire community's best interests at heart. The society became divided into those who had and those who had not, with the majority of the population becoming dependent on a small, powerful elite for their protection and sustenance. The loss of consensus was a direct result of the pressures of the collapse. It was a brutal but necessary adaptation to a new reality, a sacrifice of the old egalitarian dream for the sake of survival. The old world of cooperation was over, and the new world of command was just beginning. The Neolithic way of life was predicated on permanence, but as the foundations of that stability crumbled, communities were forced to abandon their homes and return to a life of motion. The great migrations of the late Neolithic and early Bronze Age were not a choice but a brutal necessity, a desperate search for new lands and new sources of sustenance. This mass movement of populations was a direct consequence of the environmental and social collapse, reshaping the demographic and cultural map of Europe and the Near East. Archaeological evidence for this population movement is multifaceted. First, there is the widespread and systematic abandonment of settlements. Sites that had been continuously occupied for centuries were suddenly, and without clear signs of violence, left vacant. In some cases, the material record suggests a hurried departure, with valuable possessions left behind. This indicates that the inhabitants were not fleeing a military attack, but a deteriorating environmental land that could no longer support them. The movement was not random but followed historical trade routes and natural geographical corridors, as entire communities moved in search of viable agricultural land or reliable water sources. Second, the archaeological record shows the sudden appearance of new cultural groups in regions that had been settled for millennia. The arrival of the corded ware culture in Central Europe and the Yamnaya people on the Pontic-Caspian steppe provides a prime example. These groups, characterized by a distinct pottery style and a new reliance on pastoralism, spread rapidly across the continent. Their presence often coincides with a change in burial practices and a shift in material culture, indicating that they were not simply a local evolution but a new population moving into a region. These migrations were not peaceful. As these mobile groups encountered sedentary populations, they competed for increasingly scarce resources, leading to the conflict that would define this transitional era. Third, the genetic evidence from paleogenomics provides a conclusive link. The analysis of ancient DNA from human remains across Europe shows a significant shift in population ancestry during this period. The genetic signatures of the earlier Neolithic farmers are replaced by or mixed with the genetic markers of the migrating groups. This biological evidence confirms that the cultural shifts seen in the archaeological record were the result of large-scale population replacements and genetic admixture. The migrations were not just about the movement of goods or ideas, but about the physical displacement of entire peoples. The old communities, once so rooted and secure, were now adrift in a sea of change. The Great Migration was a final, desperate act of a collapsing world, a physical search for the stability that had been lost, and a prelude to a new world that would be shaped by movement, conflict, and the consolidation of power. The Neolithic belief system was a direct reflection of its environment, a world of nurturing abundance. Faith was centered on the Great Mother, the fertile earth, and the cyclical nature of life. Its rituals and practices were designed to ensure a bountiful harvest and healthy offspring. But as the climate changed and the earth itself became a source of scarcity, this foundational spiritual contract was broken. For societies that had defined their existence by their relationship with a benevolent, life-giving divine force, the failure of the old faith was not just a crisis of belief, but a profound and devastating existential collapse. Archaeological evidence from the period of the 4.2 kiloyear event shows a clear spiritual fracturing. The small female figurines that had been ubiquitous in every home and burial site for millennia began to appear less frequently and were often damaged or fragmented. This decline in the material record of the mother goddess cults suggests a loss of efficacy. The deity who had promised abundance was no longer delivering. The old rituals, performed with such care and reverence, failed to bring the rain or restore the soil's fertility. This created a theological vacuum, forcing communities to question the very tenets of their faith and the social order that was built upon it. This spiritual crisis was not a singular event, but a prolonged and agonizing process. As the famine and conflict became more widespread, the old beliefs offered no comfort or explanation for the suffering. This led to a search for new divine powers that could offer protection in a world that was now defined by its brutality. New deities began to emerge, often with more aggressive and powerful attributes. These were sky gods and storm gods, figures who could wield forces of destruction as well as creation. Their ascendancy is reflected in the archaeological record by new votive offerings and the emergence of more militaristic iconography on pottery and other artifacts. The old communal ceremonies, which had served to unify communities through shared ritual, became less frequent or were recontextualized for different purposes. The focus shifted from collective appeals for a good harvest to individual or clan-based rituals for protection and success in conflict. This spiritual fragmentation mirrored the social breakdown of the time. Without a shared faith to bind them, communities lost their moral and social center. The breakdown of the old faith, therefore, was not a side effect of the collapse, but a central component of it. It left a spiritual void that would be filled by new, more aggressive beliefs, and a new class of leaders who could promise not prosperity from the earth, but victory from their rivals. The world was losing its spiritual anchor, and the consequences would be violent and lasting. The long period of Neolithic peace, defined by its lack of organized violence and unfortified villages, gave way to a new, brutal reality. As communities faced famine, migration, and conflict, the old cooperative ethos was replaced by a new social imperative: military prowess. This fundamental cultural shift is most powerfully evidenced in a dramatic change in burial practices, where the dead were no longer honored for their connection to the land, but for their ability to fight and kill. The rise of the warrior class is a key marker of the end of the Stone Age and the beginning of a new, more aggressive social order. Archaeological sites from this transitional period show a clear and widespread trend. A small but significant number of male burials are now accompanied by purpose-built weapons. In earlier Neolithic cultures, grave goods were often related to a person's craft or status within the community, but there was no consistent inclusion of dedicated armaments. In this new era, however, the presence of a polished stone mace head, a flint dagger, or in later stages, a copper or bronze spearhead became a clear indicator of a person's social standing. The inclusion of these items in a burial was a statement of power and a recognition of a new, valued social role. The most striking examples of this shift are seen in the burials of the corded ware culture in Central Europe and the Yamnaya people on the Pontic-Caspian steppe. These mobile pastoralist groups, whose migrations were a direct result of the climatic collapse, left behind a distinct burial record. In contrast to the collective burials of the early Neolithic, these were individual graves, often in a small mound or kurgan. The male interments frequently contain a cord-decorated beaker, an axe, and a dagger, a clear representation of a new warrior identity. These individuals were not just members of a community. They were distinguished by their ability to protect and conquer. This cultural shift was a direct response to the pressures of the time. In a world of scarcity, control over dwindling resources, water, land, and food became paramount. Military strength was no longer just a way to settle disputes. It was the most effective means of survival and accumulation of wealth. The warrior, therefore, was not just a protector, but a new kind of leader. Their status was not based on their spiritual connection to the earth or their role in a consensus-based society, but on their ability to enforce their will through force. The rise of the warrior class had profound and lasting consequences. It created a new social hierarchy where military elites stood at the top, and it accelerated the development of new military technologies. The focus shifted from the perfection of the stone tool for production to the creation of a more effective weapon. This was the final step away from the Neolithic world, a world where the power of the land had been replaced by the power of the sword. The golden age of cooperation was over, and the age of conquest had begun. The Neolithic era and the emerging Bronze Age were defined by their dominant technologies. For millennia, the stone axe was the pinnacle of human ingenuity, a multi-purpose tool perfected through countless generations of skill. Its creation was an act of collaboration, involving quarrying, shaping, and polishing, often requiring the labor of an entire community. The stone axe was a democratic tool. Its raw material was widely accessible, and its creation, while skilled, was a knowledge base shared by many. It was a tool of production, used to fell trees for homes, clear fields for crops, and work wood for various needs. The technology of stone was a testament to the old world's cooperative ethos and its reliance on the power of collective effort and shared knowledge. The advent of metal, however, introduced a new paradigm. The early copper blades were not inherently superior to their stone counterparts in every aspect. A well-made polished stone axe could be just as sharp and durable, but the copper blade possessed a transformative quality. It could be melted and recast. If a copper tool broke, it was not discarded. It was a reusable resource, a form of stored value. This fundamental difference made copper a new kind of currency, and its possession was no longer a sign of craftsmanship, but of wealth and access. The knowledge of smelting was a guarded secret, a specialized skill held by a small, mobile elite of artisans. This concentration of knowledge created a new form of power, one that was not accessible to everyone. The tale of these two technologies is, in essence, the story of two different ways of life. The stone axe was a product of the land, a resource found in nature and shaped by hand. Its creation was a part of the communal rhythm, and its use benefited the entire settlement. It symbolized a society that worked in concert with its environment, using the materials at hand to build a stable, rooted existence. The copper blade, by contrast, was a product of trade and intellectual property. Its raw material often came from distant lands, requiring complex trade networks and a new kind of commercial organization. Its creation was a sign of a new class of specialists, and its use, particularly in warfare, was a harbinger of a world no longer defined by cooperation, but by competition. The transition from stone to copper and then to bronze was not just a technological upgrade, it was a societal reset. The copper blade and its more lethal successor, the bronze sword, became the tools of a new military elite. They enabled a new kind of power that was not based on the ability to produce food or build monuments, but on the ability to take and defend resources. The polished stone axe, once a symbol of a peaceful, industrious world, became obsolete in the face of the new metal. The golden age of collaboration, symbolized by the stone axe, was over. It had been replaced by a world of conquest, defined by the glint of a copper blade. The broader narrative of the Neolithic collapse is made tangible by the fate of specific cultures. One of the most significant of these was the funnel beaker culture, a widespread Neolithic civilization that flourished across northern and central Europe for over a millennium. Characterized by its distinctive funnel-shaped pottery, communal burial sites, and large-scale megalithic monuments, this culture was a quintessential example of the cooperative agrarian world. Its rapid decline and eventual disappearance from the archaeological record serve as a chilling case study in the multifaceted causes of the Stone Age collapse. The funnel beaker culture was highly successful in adapting to the post-glacial environment, relying on a mixed economy of farming, animal husbandry, and forest exploitation. Its egalitarian social structure, evidenced by the uniform nature of its settlements and the collective burials in megalithic tombs, was a testament to a society built on consensus and mutual aid. This stability, however, made it particularly vulnerable to the environmental shocks that began around 3000 BCE. The onset of a cooler, drier climate put immense pressure on their agricultural system. The land, which had been cleared of forests and farmed continuously, began to lose its fertility, and yields became unreliable. This environmental stress directly undermined the food surplus that had sustained their population and supported their complex social and ritual life. The archaeological record shows a clear pattern of fragmentation and decline. The construction of new megalithic tombs and ritual sites, once a hallmark of their culture, slowed dramatically and then ceased entirely. The communal labor required for these projects was no longer possible, as communities were increasingly isolated and focused on immediate survival. The elaborate, uniform pottery that gave the culture its name began to lose its consistent style, and instead, regional variations and a decline in craftsmanship became apparent. This breakdown of a shared material culture reflects a corresponding fragmentation of the social and belief systems that had once united the Funnelbeaker people. The final blow to the Funnelbeaker culture came from the arrival of new, more mobile populations. Paleogenomic studies have shown that the genetic signature of the Funnelbeaker people was largely replaced by or absorbed into that of the incoming corded ware culture, a group of pastoralists whose way of life was better suited to the new environmental realities. The corded ware people brought with them not only a new economy, but also a new, more hierarchical social structure and a more militaristic ethos. Their individual burials, which often contained weapons, stand in stark contrast to the collective tombs of the Funnelbeaker. The decline of the Funnelbeaker culture was a slow process of social and environmental collapse, accelerated by the arrival of a new, more adaptable people. Their story is a powerful reminder that in a world of profound change, even the most successful civilizations can become obsolete. The Neolithic era was defined by permanence, with communities rooted in a single place for centuries. But as the foundations of this stability crumbled, a new, unsettling trend became apparent in the archaeological record: the widespread and systematic abandonment of settlements. Entire communities, which had been continuously occupied for generations, simply vanished from the landscape. This was not the result of a single catastrophic event, but a slow, agonizing process of environmental decline and social collapse, leaving behind a world of empty villages and unmade societies. The evidence for this abandonment is clear and well documented across Europe and the Near East. Archaeological surveys show that a significant number of settlements, particularly those in marginal or climatically stressed areas, were deserted. Unlike sites that were destroyed by fire or conflict, these villages show no signs of a hurried departure or a violent end. Instead, the material record suggests a gradual exodus. Valuable possessions, tools, and even pottery were often left behind, indicating that the inhabitants were not fleeing an attack, but were slowly and methodically moving on. The structures themselves were not burned or razed, but simply left to decay, with roofs caving in and walls slowly eroding back into the earth. The reasons for this widespread abandonment were a combination of environmental and social factors. The prolonged drought of the 4.2 kiloyear event made many regions uninhabitable. The agricultural land that had sustained communities for centuries became unproductive, and the water sources they relied upon dried up. Faced with a choice between starvation and migration, entire populations chose to move. The collapse of long-distance trade networks also played a crucial role. Without the ability to trade for essential goods, many communities became economically unviable and could no longer support their populations. The lack of a centralized authority or a shared social contract meant that when a crisis hit, there was no larger system to provide relief. This systematic abandonment had profound consequences. It led to a decentralization of the population, as people moved into smaller, more mobile groups in search of new resources. This shift in lifestyle broke down the old social structures and created new ones based on mobility and survival. The loss of a fixed identity and a shared history, which had been tied to a specific place for generations, had a lasting psychological impact. The empty villages and deserted fields became silent monuments to a world that was gone, a stark reminder of the fragility of a civilization that had once seemed invincible. This was a world unmade, a landscape of ghosts and ruins that would provide the backdrop for the new, more brutal era that was to come. The first walls of the Neolithic collapse were a direct response to a new era of conflict. They were built to protect a world that was rooted in place, a world that was suddenly vulnerable. However, these defenses, constructed from earth, wood, and stone, proved to be an inadequate response to the emerging forces of the early Metal Age. The transition was marked not just by the building of walls, but by their systematic failure. The first defeats were a brutal lesson in a new kind of warfare, as newly built defenses were overcome by more powerful forces, signaling the obsolescence of the old ways. Archaeological evidence from Central and Western Europe provides a clear record of this shift. Villages that had invested immense labor in building palisades and earthworks were not always successful in defending them. The remains of these fortifications often show signs of a violent end, including burn layers in the ditches and collapsed sections of wooden palisades. This suggests that the attackers possessed not only the will to fight, but also the tactical knowledge to overcome these defenses. The strategies of this new kind of warfare likely involved both direct assault and the use of fire to undermine wooden structures, a simple but effective technique against the technology of the time. The most significant factor in these defeats was the emergence of a new kind of military organization. The groups responsible for these attacks were not the small fragmented bands of the early collapse. They were often larger, more cohesive groups, such as the migrating pastoralists of the corded Ware and Yamnaya cultures. These groups, with their more hierarchical social structures, were capable of organizing larger forces for sustained conflict. They were more mobile, and their economy, based on livestock, was more resilient to the localized droughts and famines that were plaguing the sedentary agricultural communities. This gave them a decisive strategic advantage. Furthermore, the technology of the New World was beginning to assert its dominance. While the first metal weapons were rare and fragile, their psychological and tactical impact would have been immense. A bronze axe or spearhead, while not necessarily superior to a well-made stone one, was a new and terrifying force on the battlefield. The old defensive systems, built against foes with familiar stone tools, were not prepared for a new kind of opponent. The first defeats were not just military losses, they were a profound cultural shock, a realization that the old world's solutions were no longer adequate. The collapse of these defenses was a sign that the old order was truly over, and a new reality, one shaped by mobile populations and military strength, was taking its place. The failure of the first walls was the final lesson of the Stone Age, a lesson that would be learned again and again in the centuries to come. The discovery of bronze was not a singular event, but a complex process driven by a new, insatiable demand for its two primary components, copper and tin. This need for specific rare materials created an economic reality that was fundamentally different from the Neolithic world, one that was no longer based on local resources but on long-distance trade and, increasingly, on military control. The acquisition of these materials became a burden and a source of conflict that reshaped the economic and social landscape of the emerging Bronze Age. Copper was a prerequisite for any metal-based civilization, but its distribution was not uniform. While sources existed in the Balkans, Anatolia, and the Iberian Peninsula, they were often located far from major population centers. The extraction of this ore required organized labor and specialized knowledge, and its transport, in the form of ingots, became a major undertaking. The true burden, however, was the search for and acquisition of tin. This rare metal was essential for creating the hard, durable alloy of bronze, and its major sources were concentrated in only a few places, most notably the British Isles and the Erzgebirge Mountains of Central Europe. The rarity of tin created a new kind of global economy. The tin trail, a network of trade routes that connected these distant sources with the copper-rich regions of Europe and the Near East, became one of the most important arteries of the ancient world. Archaeological evidence, including shipwrecks and hoards of tin ingots, shows that this trade was both extensive and highly organized. But this system was inherently fragile. It was dependent on a series of intermediaries, and its disruption could cause an entire civilization's military and economic infrastructure to fail. This dependence on distant, unreliable sources of a key material was a profound vulnerability that the Neolithic world had never faced. This new demand for raw materials was a direct driver of conflict. Communities with access to tin and copper mines gained immense power. They could trade these resources for food, weapons, and prestige goods, creating a new class of wealthy elites. However, this wealth also made them targets. The control of these resource-rich territories became a strategic imperative, and military conflict over trade routes and mines became common. The early Bronze Age, therefore, was not just an age of technology, it was an age of conquest. The old Neolithic ways, which were built on a local subsistence economy, were ill-equipped to compete in this new globalized and militarized world. The burden of trade and the need for tin and copper was a primary force that would define the era of the first empires and the final collapse of the old ways. The first walls of the Neolithic collapse, hastily erected from earth and wood, were a testament to a world turning violent. But these defenses proved to be a final, desperate act of a dying era. The archaeological record shows a brutal and widespread trend: the destruction of formerly thriving communities. This was not the slow decay of abandonment, but a violent, systemic razing of settlements, a clear sign that a new, more brutal form of warfare had arrived. The fall of the strongholds marked a definitive end to the old ways and ushered in a world where power was taken, not grown. Evidence for this destruction is found across multiple sites. The remains of formerly unfortified villages that had recently built palisades show clear signs of a violent end. Houses were burned with thick layers of ash and carbonized wood marking the end of a settlement. The discovery of human remains scattered in the rubble, often showing signs of peri-mortem trauma from blunt force or projectile weapons, indicates a lack of ceremonial burial and a high casualty event. These were not quick raids, but acts of destruction intended to eliminate a rival community and seize its resources. The fall of a stronghold, therefore, was a total defeat, a final act of unmaking. This violence was not random. It was a strategic response to the pressures of the time. The communities that had managed to build walls and accumulate a food surplus became targets. Their wealth and their land were a prize to be taken. The attackers were often the more mobile, pastoralist groups who had been displaced by the climate event and who were more comfortable with a life of constant movement and conflict. These groups had a distinct military advantage. They were not tied to a single fixed location. Their economy, based on livestock, was more resilient to drought, and their social structure, increasingly hierarchical and militarized, was better suited for warfare. The fall of a stronghold had a ripple effect beyond its immediate community. It sent a clear message that the old ways of life-rooted, agrarian and egalitarian were no longer a guarantee of survival. The knowledge of a town's destruction would have travelled with the survivors and the refugees, creating a climate of fear and insecurity that accelerated the social fragmentation. The collapse, therefore, was not just about the failure of crops or the drying of rivers. It was about the failure of an entire social system. The fall of the strongholds was the final, brutal lesson of the Stone Age. A lesson that would be learned again and again in the centuries to come. The era of the first empires was just beginning, and they would be built on the ruins of a world that had not been able to defend itself. The Neolithic world, in its early stages, built its communities from the materials at hand: mud, stone, and an abundance of wood. This reliance on combustible materials, particularly in the construction of houses and defensive structures, created a profound vulnerability that would be brutally exploited during the period of collapse. As intercommunal conflict escalated, fire became not just an accidental consequence of battle, but a deliberate and devastating tool of warfare, a final, definitive act of unmaking. The archaeological record from this period is scarred by the evidence of these events, leaving behind thick layers of ash and carbonized wood, the remains of entire villages consumed by flames. The use of fire as a weapon was a strategic choice born of pragmatism. Early fortifications, often hastily built from wooden palisades and wattle and daub walls, were highly susceptible to fire. An attacker did not need to possess superior numbers or weaponry to breach these defenses. They only needed to set them alight. The ensuing conflagration would not only destroy the physical barriers, but would also spread to the closely packed houses within, creating panic and chaos. This tactic was highly effective against a sedentary population whose entire existence was tied to a fixed location. The loss of a settlement meant the loss of everything: food stores, homes, and a lifetime of accumulated possessions. For a community that had no alternative but to stay and fight, a fire was an overwhelming force of destruction. Archaeological evidence from numerous sites across Europe and the Near East bears witness to this. Excavations have uncovered thick, distinct layers of charcoal and ash, often several inches deep, that cover the remains of entire settlements. The carbonized timber beams and burned-out foundations of houses provide a silent but clear testimony to the scale of the destruction. In some cases, the remains of inhabitants have been found trapped within the debris of their homes, a stark reminder of the speed and ferocity of the fires. These widespread burn layers are not random. They are a clear sign of a new, more brutal form of warfare, where the objective was total destruction. The Great Fire was more than just a military tactic. It was an act of psychological warfare. The sight of a neighboring community being consumed by flames would have sent a powerful message to all who witnessed it, that the old peaceful way of life was over, and that in this new world of conflict there was no safe place to hide. The attackers, often the more mobile pastoralist groups, were less vulnerable to this tactic, as their homes were not fixed in place. The destruction of wood and wattle villages was, therefore, not just the physical unmaking of a world, but the final, definitive end of a long, peaceful era. The new world that would emerge would be one built from stone and metal, on a foundation of conquest and fear. The collapse of the Neolithic world was not a descent into anarchy, but a brutal process of reorganization. As the old communal structures failed, a new, more centralized form of social and political organization emerged from the chaos. This was the birth of the First Kingdoms, new power centers built on the principles of conquest, hierarchy, and control over resources. Unlike the old egalitarian settlements, these were powerful, centralized states that would define the political landscape of the emerging Bronze Age. Archaeological and anthropological evidence points to a clear transition from dispersed, unfortified settlements to a new model of centralized power. The First Kingdoms were often located at strategic geographical points, such as river confluences or along major trade routes. These locations provided control over water sources and the flow of goods, giving their leaders a decisive advantage in a world of scarcity. The construction of massive, permanent fortifications, often from stone and earth, around these power centers is a physical manifestation of their new status. These walls were not just for defense, they were a declaration of authority, a clear boundary between the ruling elite and the populations they controlled. The social structure of these First Kingdoms was profoundly hierarchical. The egalitarian ethos of the Neolithic was completely replaced by a system based on inherited status and military prowess. The rulers of these kingdoms, the first kings, were not chosen by communal consensus, but derived their power from their ability to command an armed force and accumulate a surplus of wealth. Their authority was absolute, and their status was often reinforced through elaborate burials containing a rich array of grave goods, including bronze weapons and rare imported materials. This divergence in burial practices, with a small number of individuals receiving extravagant interments, is a clear sign of a society divided into classes, with the majority of the population serving a small, powerful elite. The economic foundation of these early kingdoms was based on the control of resources and the organization of large-scale labor. The kings commanded the labor of their subjects for the construction of monumental defenses and the production of food. They also controlled the new bronze economy, trading the final products for raw materials and other valuable goods. This system of control created a new level of social stability, but it was a stability enforced by coercion and military might. The old social contract, based on mutual aid, was replaced by a new one based on obedience and tribute. The First Kingdoms were a direct response to the collapse of the old world. They were a brutal but effective solution to the problems of famine and conflict, and their emergence marked the definitive end of the Stone Age. From the ruins of a broken world, a new order, built on a foundation of conquest and centralized power, had finally taken shape. The collapse of the Neolithic world, though a period of immense destruction, was not an end, but a brutal prelude to a new beginning. From the ruins of a fragmented, unmade world, a new era emerged, defined by a single revolutionary technology: bronze. The dawn of the Bronze Age was a direct response to the problems of the preceding period, offering new solutions for agriculture, warfare, and social organization that would shape the course of human history for the next 2 millennia. The transition was not uniform, but the archaeological record shows a clear and widespread shift in material culture. The widespread use of stone tools, which had defined human technology for hundreds of thousands of years, rapidly gave way to a new material. Bronze, an alloy of copper and tin, was a transformative technology. Its superior hardness and durability made it far more effective than both stone and pure copper. Bronze axes could clear forests and work wood with unprecedented efficiency. Bronze sickles and plows could increase agricultural yields, providing a new way to combat the problem of soil exhaustion and food scarcity. This new technology was a pragmatic solution to the environmental and social pressures that had undone the old world. The most profound impact of bronze was in warfare. The fragile flint blades and copper ornaments of the earlier period were replaced by the first true swords, spears, and helmets. These were not simply better tools, they were instruments of conquest. A bronze sword provided a decisive advantage on the battlefield, enabling a new kind of power based on military strength. This new technology of war directly contributed to the rise of the First Kingdoms and the consolidation of power. Rulers who could command the production and distribution of bronze weapons gained immense authority, and a new warrior class, defined by its possession of these weapons, emerged as the dominant social group. This new bronze economy also created a new kind of social stability, albeit one built on coercion rather than consensus. The control of the production and trade of bronze allowed a small elite to command the labor and loyalty of a much larger population. The complexity of the bronze-making process, from mining and smelting to casting and alloying, created a class of specialized artisans who were highly valued and who were directly tied to the new ruling elite. The old communal social contract, based on mutual aid, was replaced by a new one based on obedience and tribute, in exchange for the security provided by the warrior class and the new bronze technology. The populace provided their labor and their loyalty. The dawn of the Bronze Age was therefore a reordering of the world. It was a brutal but effective response to the challenges of climate and conflict. It replaced the egalitarian ideals of the Neolithic with a new hierarchical social order and the cooperative ethos with a new model of power based on military strength and economic control. The ruins of the old world provided the foundation for a new one, a world forged in bronze and defined by its ability to take, to defend, and to conquer. The Bronze Age was an era of technological and social transformation, but its most iconic and revolutionary innovation was not a weapon but a vehicle, the chariot. This new form of transportation, pulled by domesticated horses, created a new kind of military might that would define warfare and consolidate power for centuries. The rise of the first horse-drawn warriors was a direct result of the new metallurgical and social developments of the era, and it marked a definitive end to the old ways of combat. The domestication of the horse occurred in the Pontic-Caspian steppe region around 3500 BCE, but its widespread use for military purposes came later, with the development of the chariot. The archaeological record shows that early chariots were simple, two-wheeled vehicles, often made from wood and leather, and were light enough to be pulled by a single horse. Their design was a testament to the new level of craftsmanship and engineering that emerged in the Bronze Age. The development of bronze tools and fittings, such as bits and harness components, made the construction of these complex vehicles possible and their use in battle effective. The true power of the chariot was its speed and mobility. It allowed a warrior to move rapidly across a battlefield, providing a decisive tactical advantage. The chariot was not just a delivery system for a single fighter. It was a mobile platform for archery and spear throwing. A single warrior could engage an entire infantry formation, firing a hail of arrows from a distance before retreating. This new form of warfare rendered the old, slow-moving infantry formations of the Neolithic world obsolete. The foot soldier, no matter how well armed, was no match for the speed and striking power of the chariot. The economic and social consequences of the chariot's emergence were profound. The production and maintenance of chariots and their horses were incredibly expensive and required a significant amount of wealth and resources. This concentration of wealth in the hands of a small elite chariot-owning classic accelerated the social stratification that had begun in the late Neolithic. The chariot became the ultimate status symbol, a physical manifestation of a person's military and economic power. The warriors who rode them were not just fighters. They were a new kind of nobility, a warrior aristocracy that commanded the loyalty and labor of the common populace. The lord of the chariot was, therefore, a new kind of ruler, one whose authority was based not on spiritual connection to the land or communal consensus, but on his ability to command the most advanced technology of his time. He was a military leader who could take and hold territory, an economic power who could command the labor of artisans, and a symbol of a new hierarchical social order. The chariot was more than just a military innovation. It was a catalyst for a complete reordering of society. Its emergence marked a final, brutal step away from the egalitarian ideals of the Neolithic and into a world of power, conquest, and new forms of warfare. The Neolithic belief system was intrinsically tied to the earth, with faith centered on nurturing fertility and the life-giving cycles of the seasons. Its spiritual leaders were likely figures who understood the rhythms of agriculture and the rituals that connected humanity to the soil. But as the climate changed and a new technology of fire and metal emerged, this old spiritual order was shattered. The knowledge of metallurgy, which could transform raw rock into a shining, powerful substance, was not seen as a simple craft, but as a form of magic. This gave rise to a new class of religious figures, the shamans of fire and metal, whose authority was based on their control of this transformative process. The archaeological record reveals a new type of ritual and a new kind of spiritual specialist. The old Mother Goddess figurines, so abundant in the earlier period, were increasingly replaced by objects and symbols related to sun, fire, and sky, reflecting a shift in the divine pantheon. The workshops of the first metallurgists were not just places of production, they were likely ritual spaces. The process of smelting, which involved the controlled application of intense heat to extract metal from ore, would have been a profoundly spiritual experience. The roar of the fire, the glow of the furnace, and the emergence of a liquid substance from a solid rock would have been seen as a powerful act of creation, one that placed the smith in direct communication with the divine. The smiths, or proto-alchemists, would have held a unique position in society. Their knowledge of geology, chemistry, and ritual was a form of sacred, secret knowledge, passed down orally and likely guarded closely. They were not just artisans, they were mediators between the mundane and the divine. Their rituals, which involved the chanting of incantations, the making of offerings, and the precise control of fire, were as important as the physical work itself. The objects they created, the first bronze swords, the ceremonial axes, the jewelry, were not just tools of war or status, but sacred artifacts imbued with a new kind of power. This new spiritual authority had profound social consequences. It undermined the old religious leaders who had based their power on an understanding of the earth and its cycles. In a world of conflict and scarcity, the shamans of fire and metal could promise not just a good harvest, but victory in battle and control over one's destiny. Their rituals were not for a bountiful future, but for a secure present. This shift in religious authority mirrored the broader social collapse, as the power of the old agrarian world gave way to the power of the new, more aggressive and more mobile warrior class. The sacred nature of metal and the new priests who controlled its secrets would define the spiritual world of the Bronze Age, a world that had lost its old gods but found new ones in the glow of the furnace. The Neolithic era, despite its conflicts, was largely a world without professional soldiers. Warfare was a part-time activity undertaken by farmers and craftsmen in times of necessity. But as the bronze technology emerged and the societal pressures of the collapse intensified, the very nature of conflict underwent a profound transformation. The old world of intermittent skirmishes gave way to a new reality defined by a single revolutionary innovation: the sword. This new weapon was not just a tool of war. It was a catalyst for the rise of the professional army and the permanent specialization of violence. The sword was a new class of weapon, far superior to its predecessors. Unlike the mace or the spear, which were effective at a distance, the sword was designed for close-quarters combat. Its production was a testament to the new level of metallurgical skill. It required a significant amount of metal and a complex casting process, making it an expensive and highly prized object. The possession of a sword was a clear indicator of a person's wealth and status. It was not a weapon that every member of a community could own. It was a tool of the elite. This new technology created a new type of warrior. The professional soldier, a man whose sole purpose was to train, fight, and master the art of combat, was a direct product of the bronze economy. His skills were not those of a farmer or a craftsman. They were specialized and required a lifetime of dedication. The archaeological record shows a clear change in burial practices, where a small number of male burials are found with an elaborate set of weapons, including not just a sword but also a shield, a helmet, and armor. This was not a person who was occasionally called upon to fight. This was a warrior. The rise of the professional army had profound consequences for social organization. It created a new military elite, a class of individuals whose power was based on their ability to command violence. This new warrior class was no longer beholden to the old communal social contract. They provided protection and security, but in return they demanded a tribute of food, labor, and loyalty. This system cemented the hierarchical social structures that had begun to emerge in the late Neolithic and gave rise to the first kingdoms. The professional army was the instrument of power that allowed a small elite to control a large population and to conquer and hold territory. The world of the sword was a world of permanent conflict. It was no longer a matter of a single battle to settle a dispute. It was a new reality where power was constantly being contested, and where those who did not possess the military means to protect themselves were destined to fall. The sword, therefore, was not just a weapon. It was a symbol of a new era. It was a physical manifestation of a social contract that had been rewritten, a contract where a secure present was no longer guaranteed by cooperation but by conquest. The golden age of peace was over, and the age of the sword had begun. The Neolithic spiritual world was a reflection of its agrarian, earthbound existence. Faith centered on the nurturing, fertile power of the Mother Goddess. But as the world was remade by drought, famine, and conflict, the old pantheon proved unable to provide comfort or solutions. In its place, a new spiritual order emerged, one better suited to a hierarchical, militarized society. This was the era of the ascension of the sky gods, new, more aggressive deities who took their place at the top of the pantheon. Their rise was a direct parallel to the rise of the warrior class and the new, centralized states of the Bronze Age. The archaeological record shows a clear and widespread shift in religious iconography and ritual. The abundant Mother Goddess figurines of the Neolithic become less common, while new symbols and motifs appear on pottery, artifacts, and in rock carvings. These new symbols are often associated with the sun, storms, and the sky. The old faith was a terrestrial one. The new faith was a celestial one, a reflection of a world that was now concerned with power, movement, and the celestial forces that controlled the seasons and the outcome of battle. The old rituals of a bountiful harvest were replaced by rituals of appeasement for a more volatile and demanding divine order. The new deities were predominantly male, often portrayed with powerful, aggressive attributes. They were the gods of the storm, who could bring the rain but also wield lightning. They were the gods of the sun, who could bring life but also cause drought. They were the gods of war, who could ensure victory in battle but also demand sacrifice. These were not the nurturing, life-giving deities of the old world. They were powerful, unpredictable figures who required obedience and demanded tribute. Their rise was a spiritual justification for the new social order. The king, a warrior who commanded a professional army, derived his power from his connection to these new, powerful sky gods. His authority was not based on communal consensus, but on a divine mandate to rule. The spiritual shift had profound social consequences. It cemented the hierarchical social structures that were emerging in the Bronze Age. The warrior elite, who controlled the new technology of bronze and the new form of warfare, were also the ones who mediated between the community and the new gods. The old spiritual leaders, whose power was based on a knowledge of the old ways, were replaced by a new class of priests who understood the rituals of a more aggressive and demanding divine order. The rise of the sky gods, therefore, was not just a theological event. It was a political one. It was the final, definitive end of a world that was losing its old gods and finding new ones in the sun, the storm, and the sword. The collapse of the Neolithic world and the emergence of the Bronze Age created a new global economy. The old, decentralized, down-the-line exchange of goods, based on a local subsistence economy, was replaced by a more complex and formalized system of long-distance trade. This was a world of new arteries of commerce, driven by a new insatiable demand for the raw materials of the Bronze Age: copper and, more importantly, tin. The new trade routes, such as the Amber Road and the Tin Trail, were not just pathways for goods. They were the lifelines that connected a changed world and solidified the power of the new ruling elite. The most famous of these new trade routes was the Amber Road, a network of land and sea paths that connected the Baltic Sea region, the primary source of amber, with the Mediterranean. Amber, a fossilized tree resin, was not a practical material, but its beauty and rarity made it a prized luxury good. Its presence in burial sites across Europe, from Scandinavia to Mycenaean Greece, is a clear indicator of a widespread, well-established trade network. The Amber Road was more than just a conduit for a single material. It was a cultural highway that facilitated the exchange of goods, ideas, and people. It was a tangible link between the forested north and the urban south, a sign that a new, more interconnected world had emerged. However, the most critical of the new trade routes was the Tin Trail. Tin, the essential component for bronze, was exceptionally rare, and its major sources were concentrated in only a few places, most notably Cornwall in the British Isles and the Erzgebirge Mountains of Central Europe. The demand for tin created a new level of economic organization. The Tin Trail was not a single road, but a network of paths that funneled this rare metal from its sources to the major metallurgical centers of Europe and the Near East. The movement of tin ingots, often in standardized sizes, reveals a highly organized system of extraction, transport, and trade. The control of these trade routes was a source of immense power. Rulers who could secure a reliable supply of tin could produce the weapons and tools that were the basis of the new economy and military might. The new trade routes had a profound impact on social and political structures. The old egalitarian social contract of the Neolithic was replaced by a new one based on control over these lucrative commercial arteries. The rulers of the First Kingdoms were not just military leaders, they were also economic powers who could command the labor of miners and the loyalty of merchants. This new economy, based on resource acquisition and long-distance trade, was a direct consequence of the Bronze Age. It was a world that had moved beyond a local subsistence-based economy and embraced a globalized, militarized, and increasingly unequal reality. The new trade routes were the sinews of this new world, and they would shape the course of history for millennia. The collapse of the Neolithic world and the dawn of the Bronze Age was not a single event, but a long and complex process of change. It was a great transition, a period when two worlds existed simultaneously, a world still defined by the old ways of stone, and a new world forged in bronze. The interaction between these two technologies and the social structures they represented was a central force that reshaped the human experience forever. The archaeological record from this transitional period is a mosaic of two distinct technologies. In many regions, the use of stone tools continued for centuries, often coexisting with the new metal implements. The vast majority of the population, still engaged in subsistence farming and living in dispersed villages, continued to rely on the polished stone axe for their daily needs. The skills of flint knapping and tool production, which had been perfected over millennia, did not disappear overnight. Instead, the stone world became the foundation upon which the new metal world was built. However, the bronze world was fundamentally different. Its technology was more efficient, its social structure more hierarchical, and its economic reach more global. The possession of a bronze axe or sword was a clear indicator of a person's status and access to a new centralized system of power. The new economy, based on the long-distance trade of copper and tin, created a new class of leaders who were not just military commanders, but also economic powers. They were the masters of a new centralized system of production and distribution, a system that was a direct result of the pressures and opportunities of the collapse. The interaction between these two worlds was not always peaceful. The mobile, militarized bronze-wielding groups often came into conflict with the sedentary, stone-using populations. These conflicts were not just over land and resources, they were a clash of two different social and technological paradigms. The bronze-wielding groups, with their superior weapons and more flexible social structures, often had a decisive military advantage. The result was a pattern of conquest, displacement, and cultural assimilation, which is clearly visible in the archaeological and genetic record. The great transition from a world of stone to a world of bronze, therefore, was a period of both destruction and creation. It was a time when the old egalitarian ideals of the Neolithic were challenged and replaced by a new, more hierarchical and militarized reality. The stone tools that had built a world of peace and cooperation gave way to the bronze weapons that would build a world of conquest and empire. The new world that emerged from the collapse was not a utopia, but it was a world that had found a new, albeit brutal, way to survive. The memory of the stone world would live on in its myths and its ruins, but the future belonged to bronze. The dawn of the Bronze Age was a period of immense destruction and radical change, but the transition was not a clean break with the past. While the old world's social structures and technologies were largely replaced, elements of the Neolithic way of life lingered, echoing into the new era. These were the enduring legacies of the old ways, subtle but significant influences that demonstrate how the memory of a peaceful, cooperative world survived the transition to a world of metal and conflict. The most visible of these echoes was in technology. Despite the ascendancy of bronze, stone tools did not disappear overnight. The vast majority of the population, particularly those in rural agrarian communities, continued to rely on flint and polished stone for their daily needs. Bronze was a valuable and expensive commodity, reserved primarily for elite tools, weapons, and ceremonial objects. The common farmer still used a stone sickle to harvest his crops and a polished stone axe to clear his fields. The skills of flint knapping and tool production, which had been perfected over millennia, were passed down through generations, a form of technological heritage that coexisted with the new metallurgical knowledge. This dual technology economy is a clear sign that the old ways were not completely abandoned, but were, in fact, the foundation upon which the new world was built. The old spiritual beliefs also left their mark. While the nurturing mother goddess cults waned in prominence, their symbolism and core concepts did not vanish entirely. The new, aggressive, male deities of the sky and sun often absorbed attributes of the older, earth-based divine. The cyclical nature of life and death, so central to Neolithic faith, was recontextualized within the new pantheon. The old megalithic sanctuaries, though no longer centers of new construction, continued to hold a sacred power. They were reappropriated as ceremonial sites, burial places, or territorial markers by the new Bronze Age communities. The memory of their purpose and the immense labor of their construction created a sense of historical depth and a link to a mythic past that was valued even by the new warrior elite. The social structures of the Old World also left a lingering legacy. While the new kingdoms were profoundly hierarchical, the old communal ties and kinship groups did not disappear. They became the fundamental units of the new social order, with a family's status and loyalty to a king often determined by its clan affiliation. This was a world that was both new and old, a tapestry woven from the threads of both eras. The echoes of the past, therefore, were not just relics, they were the very foundation of the new world. The memory of a world without war, a world of communal effort, and a world of earth-based faith would linger on, a constant reminder of what had been lost, and a silent influence on what was to come. The collapse of the Neolithic world was a catastrophic event, a long and brutal process of environmental and social decline. It was a period of immense destruction and suffering, but its enduring legacy is not just in the ruins it left behind. It is in the wisdom that can be gleaned from the archaeological record lessons about societal resilience, the fragility of a stable climate, and the consequences of unsustainable practices. This was humanity's first global-scale environmental and social collapse, and its story holds profound lessons for our own time. The most significant lesson lies in the profound vulnerability of a society built on a single fragile foundation. The Neolithic world's prosperity was entirely dependent on a stable climate and a fertile soil. The agrarian revolution, while a triumph of human ingenuity, created a system that was brittle and ill-equipped to handle the shocks of the 4.2 kiloyear event. The lesson here is clear. Over-reliance on a single economic or environmental model, without a plan for diversification or sustainability, creates a deep and fundamental vulnerability. When the climate changed, the entire system failed, demonstrating that even a long period of prosperity can be undone by a single catastrophic environmental shift. The collapse also teaches us about the interconnectedness of social and environmental systems. The drought and soil exhaustion did not just cause a famine, they triggered a cascade of social and political failures. The old cooperative ethos, which had been a product of a world of abundance, fractured under the pressure of scarcity. Egalitarian social structures gave way to hierarchical, militarized ones. The long-distance trade networks, which had been the lifeblood of the Neolithic economy, were disrupted, leading to further isolation and conflict. This was a direct feedback loop. Environmental stress led to social fragmentation, which in turn made the community less resilient to further environmental shocks. Finally, the collapse demonstrates the critical importance of adaptation. The groups that survived and thrived in the emerging Bronze Age were not those who clung to the old ways, but those who embraced new technologies, new social structures, and new economic models. The pastoralist cultures, with their more mobile and resilient economies, were better equipped to survive the prolonged drought. The new bronze technology, while a catalyst for conflict, also provided new solutions for agriculture and resource management. The new kingdoms, while brutal and hierarchical, provided a new form of social stability that, for a time, allowed for the re-emergence of large-scale societies. The first collapse, therefore, was a brutal but necessary test of societal resilience. It was a reminder that the ability to change, to adapt, and to innovate is not just a key to prosperity, but a fundamental requirement for survival. The wisdom in the soil is a stark and powerful lesson. A world that cannot adapt is a world that is destined to be unmade. The collapse of the Neolithic world and the brutal birth of the Bronze Age was a period of immense change. But its story is not confined to the archaeological record. The memory of this monumental transition, though unrecorded in writing, was passed down through generations, shaping the myths, legends, and cultural memory of subsequent civilizations. The enduring mythos of the Stone Age haunts us to this day, a silent but powerful influence on our understanding of our own past and the fragility of our present. One of the most potent of these echoes is the flood narrative, found in countless cultures across the globe, from the Epic of Gilgamesh to the biblical account of Noah. The story of a great deluge that destroys a corrupt world and leaves only a single family to rebuild is a direct reflection of the catastrophic environmental events of the 4.2 kiloyear event. The memories of a world consumed by vanishing waters and a civilization unmade by drought became a foundational narrative for the new hierarchical societies of the Bronze Age. The moral of the story was clear. A world that oversteps its bounds will be destroyed, and a new, more obedient society will emerge from the ruins. This mythos was a spiritual justification for the new order and a warning about the consequences of societal failure. The memory of the Neolithic world also survived in the form of a Golden Age narrative. Later societies, looking back on a time of unfortified villages and communal cooperation, saw not a primitive past, but a utopia lost. The legends of a world without war, a time when humans lived in harmony with the earth, were not just stories. They were a collective memory of a time before the burdens of hierarchy, conflict, and a globalized economy. The tales of a nurturing, life-giving deity who promised a bounty from the earth, though replaced by a more aggressive pantheon, lived on in the form of folk tales and in the substratum of later religious beliefs. This myth of a lost golden age was a powerful influence on subsequent philosophical and religious thought, a constant reminder of a time when the world was simpler and more just. The enduring mythos of the Stone Age, therefore, is not a simple archaeological curiosity. It is a living, breathing part of our cultural heritage. It shapes our stories about the origins of civilization, the consequences of environmental change, and the constant human struggle between cooperation and conflict. The memory of a world unmade by drought and a social order shattered by a new technology is a powerful and resonant narrative that continues to haunt us. It is a stark reminder that even the most stable civilizations are built on a foundation of sand, and that the lessons of the first collapse are as relevant today as they were 4 millennia ago.